I didn't think it would feel like this. That's the honest truth, and I might as well start there. I spent 37 years telling myself that when the day finally came, when the alarm stopped and the briefcase stayed in the closet and nobody needed anything from me before 8 in the morning, I would feel free. That's the word I used. Free. I said it to Carol. I said it to the guys at work. I said it to myself on every long commute home when the highway was backed up and my back ached and my phone wouldn't stop going. I'd think someday I won't have to do this anymore, and that thought felt like something to look forward to. What nobody told me, what I couldn't have understood until I was sitting inside it, is that free and invisible are not the same thing, but they can feel identical when you're 68 years old and the world has quietly stopped needing you to show up anywhere. It was a Tuesday in October, not a bad day by any measure. The weather was decent. Carol was moving around the house, doing her things. There was coffee in the pot and food in the refrigerator and money in the bank. Everything was fine. Everything was exactly what I'd worked toward for nearly 4 decades. And I was sitting at the kitchen table doing absolutely nothing. Not resting, not relaxing, just sitting there the way an object sits somewhere, without purpose, without direction, without anybody in the world waiting on me to do or say or decide a single thing. And something moved through me in that moment that I didn't have a name for right away. It wasn't sadness exactly. It was closer to the feeling you get when you realize mid-sentence that nobody in the room is listening. That particular specific feeling of having become irrelevant in a space where you used to matter. I lifted my hands around that coffee mug and I thought, who are you now? Not in a philosophical way, in a genuinely disoriented way. Like a man who's been wearing the same uniform for 37 years and one morning looks down and it's gone, and he can't quite remember what he looks like without it. The morning light was coming through the kitchen blinds in those long flat strips, moving slow across the floor as the sun shifted. And I watched them because I had nothing else to do with my eyes. That's a thing that happens in retirement that you're not prepared for. You start noticing the light moving across the floor because nothing else in the room is moving. The refrigerator hummed. Somewhere down the street, a lawnmower started up. Carol's slippers shuffled softly on the hard wood in the next room, and I could hear the low murmur of the morning news she keeps on while she gets her day going. Her day. She had a day. Tuesdays she volunteers at the church. Thursdays too. Second Wednesday of the month is book club. Sundays she calls her sister. Her life had edges. Shape. Mine had gone soft in a way I didn't know how to talk about yet. Soft the way bread goes soft when it's been sitting out too long. Still there, still technically fine, but not what it was. I'd been retired 14 months at that point. 14 months of everyone telling me I'd earned it. Of nodding and agreeing, of saying, yeah, it's great. Real different. But great, because what else do you say? What do you say when the thing everyone congratulates you for turns out to have a side nobody mentioned? The side where you wake up one morning and realize that for 37 years your identity wasn't something you carried inside yourself. It was something the job held for you. It was in the alarm at 5:15, and the thermos of coffee, and the 40-minute commute, and Diane's printed schedule on the desk, and the particular way people looked up when you walked into a room because you were the one who knew what to do next. Strip all of that away, and what's left? That was the question sitting across from me at that kitchen table on that ordinary Tuesday in October. Quiet and patient and not going anywhere. What's left? I was 68 years old, and I did not have a clean answer. I pushed back from the table and stood up slow, my knee doing its usual morning complaint, and I walked to the window and looked out at the neighborhood. The Henderson sprinklers running across the street. A woman I didn't recognize walking a dog on the sidewalk, moving with that easy, purposeful stride of someone who has somewhere to be after this. The mail truck still a couple hours off. Everything normal, everything fine. And me standing there in a house I'd spent 31 years paying off feeling like a stranger in my own morning, which is a feeling I want to describe carefully because it wasn't dramatic and it wasn't a breakdown, and from the outside you couldn't have seen a single thing wrong. It was just a man at a window. Just a retired man on a Tuesday with nowhere to be. But inside that ordinary picture, something was happening that I hadn't been prepared for and couldn't quite name yet, and was only beginning to understand would take a long time to find my way through. This is that story. Not the version where everything worked out neat and clean by the third month. The real version. The one that took longer and hurt quieter and asked more of me than I expected. The one I wish someone had told me before I walked out of that office with a sheet cake and a handshake, thinking I knew what was coming next. If you want to understand what retirement did to me, you first have to understand what work was. And I don't mean work in the abstract, not just the job title or the paycheck or the benefits package. I mean what it actually was inside my daily life, what it felt like to be a working man with somewhere to be every single morning, what it gave me that I didn't even know it was giving me until it was gone. I spent 37 years in logistics management. Started out as a floor supervisor at a regional distribution center in Ohio when I was 29 years old, fresh off a stint in sales that hadn't gone anywhere interesting. And I worked my way up over the decades until I was running operations for a mid-sized freight company out of Columbus. Nothing glamorous. We weren't shipping anything exotic. Industrial parts, retail goods, the kind of cargo that keeps the country running but nobody thinks about when they're buying something off a shelf. But I was good at it. I understood systems. I understood how to look at a process and find where it was bleeding time or money. And I knew how to talk to people, how to get a warehouse crew moving on a Monday morning when everyone would rather be anywhere else. That was my skill. That was the thing I was known for. For 37 years, I had a reputation, a function, a reason to walk through a door every morning. And that matters more than most people realize until the door is no longer theirs to walk through. My alarm went off at 5:15 every weekday morning for most of my career. 5:15, not 5:30, because I liked having a few minutes to just sit with the quiet before the day took over. I'd get up without waking Carol, feel my way to the bathroom in the dark, splash cold water on my face, and stand there for a moment looking at myself in the mirror. Not in a vain way, just checking in, making sure I was there, making sure the man looking back was ready. Then I'd dress. Usually had my clothes laid out the night before, an old habit I picked up early that I never let go of. Khakis, a button-down, sometimes a tie depending on what the day held. Down to the kitchen, start the coffee. Let the dog out if we still had the dog. Stand at the back door for a minute while the coffee ran and just listen to the neighborhood waking up. Birds first, then a garage door somewhere down the street, then the distant hum of traffic building on the overpass a half-mile away. The world clocking in. And I was part of that. I was one of those sounds in someone else's morning. That thought always sat right with me. I was on the road by 6, sometimes earlier if we had a big shipment coordinating or a client review scheduled. The drive was 40 minutes on a good day, longer in winter when the highway got stupid. But I didn't mind the drive, not most days. There's something about those early morning commutes that feels like your own private time. Just you and the radio and the headlights of the cars coming the other way, everybody moving towards something. I'd listen to sports radio or news, sometimes nothing at all, just the engine and the road. I had a thermos of coffee in the cup holder, the same black stainless one for about 12 years until the lid finally cracked and Carol bought me a new one that I never liked as much. The work itself was demanding in ways that are hard to explain to someone who hasn't managed a large operation. It wasn't physically hard, not by the time I was in my 40s and 50s. My body wasn't taking the beating the floor guys were taking, but the mental load was constant. There were always problems. A shipment delayed, a driver who called in sick, a client who wanted to change the delivery window at the last minute, equipment that broke down at the worst possible time. And those problems came to me. That's what my position meant. It meant the problems came to me, and I solved them. And then more problems came, and I solved those too. Day after day, year after year. And I want to be clear about something, because I think people sometimes assume that being the person the problems come to is exhausting and thankless, and sometimes it was. But it also meant something. It meant I was necessary. It meant that without me, things didn't run right. That's not ego talking. That's just what it felt like to hold a position of real responsibility. You walk into a building and people look up, not because you're important in any grand sense, but because you're the one who knows what to do next. That feeling, that quiet, daily confirmation that you matter to the machinery of something, that's what I had for 37 years. Lunch was usually at my desk. Turkey sandwich from the deli down the road 2 or 3 days a week, leftovers from whatever Carol had made the night before the other days. I'd eat while I read due afternoon reports or returned emails. My assistant for the last 11 years, a sharp young woman named Diane, would leave a printed copy of the afternoon schedule on my desk every morning before I arrived. I don't know why I loved that so much, that printed schedule. But I did. There was something grounding about it. Here is what today looks like. Here is your shape. The afternoons were usually when the real decisions got made. Morning was for responding and reacting. Afternoon was for thinking and planning. I liked the rhythm of it. I liked knowing what mode I was supposed to be in at any given hour. By the time I was heading home, usually between 5 and 6, sometimes later, I was tired in a way that felt earned. Not depleted, not destroyed, just used up in the right way. Like a good pair of work boots at the end of a long day. I'd pull into the driveway and sit in the car for a minute sometimes, just decompressing, watching the lights on in the front window of the house, knowing Carol was in there, knowing dinner was probably close, and feeling the day settle off my shoulders. I was a husband, a father, a manager, a colleague, a problem solver, a decision maker. All of those things at once. All of the time. I didn't think about it in those terms back then because I was too busy living it. But that's what I was. In all of it, every single role, every single responsibility was attached in one way or another to that job, to that alarm at 5:15, and that thermos of coffee and that 40-minute drive. When the job ended, I didn't lose just an occupation. I lost the entire structure that had been holding my identity upright for nearly 4 decades. I just didn't know that yet. I retired on a Friday in August. There was a little send-off at the office. Nothing too elaborate, just the team gathered in the conference room. A sheet cake from the grocery store bakery with blue frosting that said, "Congratulations, Ray," in slightly uneven letters. A card that everybody had signed. A few kind words from my regional director who flew in from Pittsburgh for the occasion. People shook my hand. Some of them hugged me. Diane cried a little, which surprised me and also touched me more than I let on. There were some laughs, some good-natured ribbing about finally getting to sleep in, about all the fishing I'd always talked about doing, but never actually did, about Carol finally having me underfoot full-time, which got the biggest laugh of the room. I smiled through all of it and meant it. I genuinely meant it. Because standing there in that conference room with the afternoon sun coming through the windows and the smell of that grocery store cake and 37 years of my professional life drawing to a close, I felt something that I can only describe as relief mixed with excitement, mixed with a kind of proud exhaustion. I had done it. I had put in the time, done the work, held it all together, and now I was being released into a life that was entirely my own. That was how it felt. Like a release. Like being let out of something good but confining into open air. I drove home that Friday evening with the windows down, which I almost never do, because I usually have the air conditioning on. But that evening I wanted the air on my face. I stopped at the steakhouse on the way home, the good one off Route 40 that Carol and I only went to for special occasions. And I called her from the parking lot and told her to get dressed, because we were celebrating. We had a nice dinner. Good steaks. A bottle of red wine that cost more than I'd usually spend without thinking twice about it, dessert, the whole thing. We talked about what was coming. We talked about it the way you talk about a vacation you've been planning for a long time, with that pleasant anticipation, listing the things you're looking forward to, the places you might go, the projects around the house that had been waiting for years. I was going to finally redo the back deck. I was going to get serious about golf. Not just the occasional Saturday round, but real practice. Lessons maybe, getting my handicap down to something respectable. We talked about driving out to see our daughter and her family in Arizona, spending a real stretch of time there instead of the long weekend visits that were all we could ever manage when I was working. I was going to read more. I had a list somewhere of books I'd been meaning to get to for years. Serious books. History and biography mostly, the kind you can't rush through. I was going to take my time with things. That was the phrase I kept using that night at dinner. I'm going to take my time. Like time had been the one thing I was always short of, and now I had an endless supply of it. Carol was happy. She reached across the table and put her hand over mine and said she was proud of me, and I believed her, and I squeezed her hand back, and it felt like the beginning of something good. The first few weeks of retirement were genuinely fine. Better than fine, actually. I slept later than I had in decades, and the novelty of that alone was enough to keep me in a good mood. 7 o'clock, 7:30, sometimes 8, just lying there in the quiet of the bedroom with no alarm and no particular urgency, feeling the morning light change through the curtains and thinking, I can stay right here if I want to. That's mine now. My time is mine. I puttered around the house in a way I'd never been able to before. Fixed the squeaky door hinge that had been bothering me for 2 years. Cleaned out the garage, which had become something of an archaeological dig of accumulated family history. Boxes of the kids' old school stuff, holiday decorations, sporting equipment from activities nobody had done in 15 years. I organized it all over the course of a week, built a little shelving system along the back wall, swept it out, stood back and looked at it with genuine satisfaction. These were good days. Productive. Calm. Mine. I called my buddy Phil, who had retired a couple years before me, and we played golf 3 times in the first month, which was more golf than I'd played in the previous 2 years combined. Phil had adjusted well to retirement, seemed happy enough, had his routine down. He told me the first 6 months were the best, and I figured he just meant the novelty of freedom hadn't worn off yet. And that was fine because I planned to keep finding new things to fill the time. Carol and I took that trip to Arizona to see our daughter Michelle and her husband and the grandkids, 2.5 weeks, which felt luxurious after years of long weekends. We went to Sedona, did some easy hiking, had dinners out on the back patio in that dry, warm air that's so different from Ohio in September. It was a good trip. I came home feeling refreshed, feeling like retirement was working the way it was supposed to work. But somewhere around the 3-month mark, something started shifting. It was subtle at first, so subtle I didn't name it right away. The days were still full enough on the surface. There were still things to do, errands to run, the deck project I'd started, a few home repairs, golf when Phil was available. But something underneath was changing. The days that had felt like freedom were starting to feel like they had a lot of empty space in them. Space I hadn't figured out how to fill with anything that felt like it mattered. I'd finish a task and stand in the middle of a room and think, okay, what's next? And the answer was smaller than I expected. Not nothing, there was always something on a list somewhere. But nothing urgent, nothing that needed me specifically, nothing that would fall apart if I didn't get to it until tomorrow or next week or eventually. And I started to notice that the anticipation I'd felt at that steakhouse dinner in August, that warm, excited sense of possibility, had quietly started to fade. Not dramatically. Not all at once, just slowly, the way daylight fades in October, where you don't notice it happening moment to moment, but one day you look up and realize it's dark by 5:30 and you're not sure exactly when that started. I kept waiting for retirement to feel the way I thought it was going to feel. I kept waiting for that deep settled contentment that I assumed was just around the corner once I got fully adjusted. I'd read enough articles, heard enough people talk about retirement, that I had a clear picture in my head of what it was supposed to look like. Leisurely mornings, meaningful hobbies, travel, time with grandchildren, the slow, peaceful enjoyment of a life well lived. And pieces of that were true. Pieces of it were real. But the full picture, the way it was supposed to come together into something that felt complete and satisfying and enough, that picture kept not quite arriving. And I didn't know what to do with that. I didn't know who to say it to. So mostly, I didn't say it to anyone. I just kept getting up every morning and trying to make the day feel like it was supposed to. It started with the mornings. That's where I first felt it. Not in any dramatic way, just in the quiet accumulation of mornings that began to feel identical to one another in a way that working mornings never had. When I was working, even the routine days had variety baked into them. There was always something different waiting on the other side of that commute. A different problem, a different conversation, a different pressure point that needed attention. The sameness of the schedule contained genuine unpredictability, and that unpredictability, I came to understand much later, was a kind of fuel. It kept me oriented towards something. It gave each morning a reason to be different from the one before it. Retirement mornings didn't have that. I'd wake up, usually around 7 now that the novelty of sleeping in had worn off, and my body had simply recalibrated to its own natural rhythm, and I'd lie there for a moment in the gray quiet of the bedroom and run through what the day held. And the list was short. Maybe an errand, Maybe a home project if I was in the middle of one. Golf if Phil was free. But Phil wasn't always free because Phil had a life with its own schedule that didn't always have room for a midweek round. Carol would already be up, already moving through her morning, because Carol's days still had that shape I mentioned. She had places to be. I was glad for her, I was. But there was something uncomfortable about watching someone else's day have structure while mine sat there waiting to be filled. I'd come downstairs and make coffee. The real coffee now. The good stuff I'd bought myself as a sort of retirement gift. A proper coffee maker that ground the beans fresh and took a little longer and produced something genuinely worth drinking. And I'd stand at the counter while it ran and look out the kitchen window at the backyard and just think about nothing in particular. About everything and nothing. The coffee was good, the backyard was quiet, the neighbor's cat was usually sitting on the fence doing whatever cats do in the early morning when they think nobody's watching. These were fine moments, peaceful even, but peace and emptiness can look a lot alike from the outside, and from the inside the difference is something you feel in the chest rather than see with your eyes. The phone was the thing I noticed most. When I was working, my phone was constant. Calls, texts, emails, the thing was always going. I used to complain about it. I used to put it face down at the dinner table and tell Carol I just needed 30 minutes where that thing wasn't demanding something from me. And she'd smile because she knew I'd pick it up before the meal was over anyway, because I couldn't quite help it, because being needed felt like breathing, something you only notice when it stops. After retirement, the phone got quiet. Not silent, not completely. Family still called. The kids checked in, though less often than I would have liked, and more out of a general sense of keeping in touch than because anything specific was happening. Carol's calls were mostly practical. She'd call from the grocery store to ask if we needed something, that kind of thing. But the professional calls stopped. The calls that meant something needed my attention, that someone was waiting on me to make a decision or solve a problem or give direction, those calls just stopped one day and never came back. I'd pick up my phone sometimes in the afternoon and look at it and there'd be nothing. A weather alert maybe, a news notification, one of those promotional emails from a sporting goods store I'd bought something from 2 years ago, and apparently would be hearing from forever. I'd set it back down and feel something I couldn't quite name yet. A hollowness. A small but persistent awareness that I was no longer in anybody's loop. The neighbors helped me see it too, though not in any intentional way. Most of the people on our street were still working. The Garcias next door, both in their mid-50s, were out of the house by 7:30 every morning. Backing out of the driveway with that purposeful efficiency, I recognized immediately. The young couple 2 houses down couldn't have been more than 35 left even earlier, sometimes before I was up. I'd watch them from the window sometimes, not in a creepy way, just noticing, just watching the neighborhood perform its daily routine of departure and return, and feeling myself on the outside of that rhythm in a way I hadn't expected. I was the one who stayed. I was the one who watched them leave. There's a particular quality to the neighborhood at 9 in the morning on a weekday that you never experience when you're part of the working world. The stillness of it. The way the streets go quiet after the last of the morning commuters have cleared out. The occasional sound of a lawn service truck or a delivery van, but otherwise just the birds and the wind and the distant hum of the overpass. It's a pleasant stillness objectively. But when you're 68 years old and you've spent nearly 4 decades being part of the morning departure, standing in that weekday stillness on the outside of it has a particular feeling that I describe as being gently but unmistakably left behind. I started going to the grocery store more often than I needed to. I recognized this for what it was even as I was doing it. I didn't need to go every other day. Carol and I didn't go through groceries that fast. But I'd find reasons. We were low on something, or I wanted to try a recipe I'd seen on TV, or I just thought a walk through the store would be a good way to get out of the house for an hour, and it was. It sounds almost embarrassing to say that a trip to the grocery store became something I looked forward to, but there it is. Because in the grocery store there were people. There was noise and motion and the low, pleasant chaos of a public space doing what it was designed to do. There was the woman at the deli counter who always said good morning. The older gentleman who stocked the produce section and who I'd exchanged maybe 6 words with total, but whose presence felt familiar and therefore comforting. There was just the general ambient fact of other people existing around me, and that, I was beginning to realize, was something I was getting less of than I needed. I didn't tell Carol any of this, not directly. She'd ask how I was doing in that careful way she had, and I'd say fine, which wasn't exactly a lie, but wasn't the whole truth either. I didn't have the words for it yet, and beyond that, I felt something close to shame about it. What kind of man retires after 37 years of hard work and then feels lost in the quiet? What kind of man has everything he worked for and still feels like something is missing? I thought it was weakness. I thought it was ingratitude. So I kept it inside and kept filling the days as best I could and kept waiting for the feeling to pass. It didn't pass. It just got quieter about itself, the way certain things do when they decide to settle in for a longer stay. There was a specific afternoon in November, about 5 months into retirement, when everything I'd been quietly feeling finally organized itself into something I could no longer avoid looking at directly. It didn't announce itself. It didn't come with any particular drama. It came the way most real things come. Wrapped in something ordinary, hiding inside a moment so small that under different circumstances I probably would have forgotten it by the next morning. My son David called that afternoon. David lives in North Carolina with his wife and their 2 boys, and he calls on Sundays mostly, the way adult children do when they've settled into their own lives, and the calls are warm but scheduled, comfortable but brief. So when his name came up on my phone on a Wednesday afternoon, I felt a small lift, a genuine one. The kind that surprised me a little with its intensity. I answered on the second ring, and we talked for a few minutes. Easy conversation. How are you? How are the boys? How's Carol? The usual circuit. And then he said the thing that he meant entirely as a practical question, and that landed in me like something much larger. He said, "Hey, Dad, I've been meaning to ask, do you have any sense of what your schedule looks like over the next few months? Because we're trying to plan a visit, and I just want to make sure we pick a time that works for you." He said it casually, the way you ask someone a simple logistical question. "Do you have any sense of what your schedule looks like?" And I opened my mouth to answer, and the answer was so immediate and so vast that for a moment I didn't say anything at all. My schedule. I had no schedule. I had an entirely open calendar stretching out in front of me like a field with no fences, and any day he wanted to come was a day that worked for me, because every day worked for me, because no day was different from any other in any way that actually mattered. I said something like, "Oh, any time is fine, just let me know what works for you all." And David said, "Great, we'll figure something out." And we talked for a few more minutes, and then he had to get back to work, had a meeting at 3, said he'd call Sunday. And I set the phone down on the kitchen counter and stood there. The refrigerator hummed. The afternoon light was doing that thing it does in November where it comes in low and golden and makes everything look like a photograph of itself. And I stood there with the full weight of what I'd just experienced settling down through me like cold water through sand. Any time is fine. Any time. I was 68 years old, and any time was fine because I had nothing. Not nothing in the destitute sense. Not nothing in the catastrophic sense. Carol and I were comfortable. The house was paid off. The retirement account was in reasonable shape. I had my health, more or less, the usual complaints of a man my age, but nothing serious. I had a wife who loved me, children who checked in, grandchildren whose pictures were on the refrigerator. By every external measure, I was a man who had done well and landed softly. But inside that comfortable life, I had nothing that required me. Nothing that would notice my absence. Nothing that needed me to show up on any particular day at any particular time and be the person who knew what to do. And I want to try to explain what that realization felt like, because I don't think it's something that's easy to understand if you haven't been there. It wasn't sadness exactly, though there was sadness in it. It wasn't self-pity, though I'm sure it looked something like that from the outside. It was more like a sudden, clear-eyed recognition of something that had been true for months, but that I'd been moving around rather than through. It was the recognition that the thing I had built my sense of self on, not just my career but my function, my role, my place in the machinery of other people's lives, was gone, and I hadn't built anything to replace it. I thought about my father then, which I don't do as often as maybe I should. My father worked in a steel mill in western Pennsylvania for 34 years and retired at 62 with a pension and a handshake, and then spent the next 11 years sitting in his recliner watching television and slowly disappearing into himself. I watched that happen as a young man, and I thought, that won't be me. I'm going to have hobbies. I'm going to stay active. I'm going to keep my mind working. I'm not going to just sit down and wait. I had thought about retirement with the arrogance of someone who had never actually been there, who assumed that willpower and intention would be enough to shape it into something meaningful. And standing in my kitchen on that November afternoon, I heard my father's silence in my own house and understood for the first time that what happened to him wasn't weakness or lack of effort. It was what happens when the thing that organized your entire identity is suddenly absent and there is nothing waiting in its place. He didn't know how to be himself without the mill, and I was beginning to understand that I didn't know how to be myself without the job. The worst part, the part that took me the longest to be honest about, was the invisibility. That's the word that kept coming back to me in the weeks after that phone call. Invisibility. Because that's what it felt like. When I was working, I was visible. I walked into a room and the room responded. I sent an email and people acted on it. I made a decision, and the decision had consequences in the real world. I was a node in a network, and the network knew I was there. In retirement, I had stepped out of the network entirely, and the network had closed seamlessly behind me, the way water closes over a stone. Nobody was waiting on my input. Nobody needed my decision. My experience, 37 years of hard-won operational knowledge and problem-solving and people management, all of it was sitting inside me with nowhere to go, like a language no one around me spoke anymore. I went for a drive that evening. Just to move. Just to be somewhere other than inside the house with those thoughts. I got on the highway and drove west for about 20 minutes and then turned around and came back, which is not something I would ever have done when I was working because 20 minutes of highway in the wrong direction meant 40 minutes back and an hour out of an evening that was already short. But I had the time. I had all the time. I drove, and I thought, and by the time I pulled back into the driveway, the sky had gone dark, and Carol had the lights on in the front room, and I sat in the car for a while. The way I used to sit after a long workday, except this time I wasn't decompressing from too much. I was just sitting with too little. I went inside, and Carol asked how I was doing, and I said I was fine. And she looked at me the way she sometimes does. That particular look she's developed over 43 years of marriage. The one that says, I know that's not the whole answer, but I'm going to let you find your way to it in your own time. I sat down in the living room and turned on the television and watched something I can't even remember now. And outside the November wind was picking up, and somewhere down the street a dog was barking at something in the dark. And I sat there understanding for the first time with real clarity that the life I had stepped into was going to require something from me that I hadn't prepared for. Not activity, not hobbies, not a fuller calendar, something deeper than all of that, something closer to the question of who I actually was when you took away everything I'd used to answer that question for the past 37 years. I didn't have an answer. Not that night. Not for a long time after that night. But at least I finally knew what the question was. The days had a texture to them now that I hadn't anticipated and couldn't quite describe to anyone without feeling like I was complaining about something I had no right to complain about. That was the particular trap of it. The struggle was real, but it came wrapped in so much privilege, so much comfort, so much of what other people worked their whole lives toward, that voicing it felt almost indecent. So I carried it quietly, the way men of my generation tend to carry things, and I let it shape my days in ways I was only half aware of at the time. Mornings were the hardest. I know I keep coming back to the mornings, but that's because mornings were where the day announced itself, where its shape or lack of shape was most apparent. I'd wake up somewhere between 6:30 and 7, my body still keeping something close to its old schedule, even without the alarm. And there'd be that brief, half-awake moment before full consciousness arrived, where I'd feel normal, where I'd feel like a man was somewhere to be. And then awareness would settle in like a slow tide and I'd remember. No meeting, no schedule. No Diane's printed agenda waiting on a desk with my name on the door. Just the day, open and shapeless, waiting for me to decide what to do with it. I started filling the mornings with routines the way you fill a crack in a wall. Not because the crack is fixed, but because you need to stop seeing it every time you walk past. I'd make the coffee. Read the newspaper, which I'd always meant to do properly when I was working, and now did thoroughly and a little too slowly, reading pieces I didn't care about just to have something to do with my eyes. I'd do a crossword puzzle, which I'd started as a way to keep the mind sharp, and which I genuinely enjoyed for about 3 weeks before it started feeling like something I was doing to prove I was okay, rather than because it actually gave me pleasure. I'd take a walk around the neighborhood, same route most days, down Elmwood to the park and back, 40 minutes if I took my time. The walks were good for the body. The doctor had told me to keep moving, and I was keeping moving. But there's a difference between exercise that clears your head and exercise that just moves your legs while your head stays exactly where it was, and most of my walks fell into the second category. I'd come back home, and it would be 9:30, maybe 10, and the day would still be almost entirely in front of me. The afternoons were a particular kind of long that I don't think I'd ever experienced before retirement. When you're working, the afternoon is the business end of the day. It's when the real decisions get made, when the pace either picks up or you're pushing through to get things closed out before evening. The afternoon had always felt purposeful to me. In retirement, the afternoon just stretched. I'd eat lunch, usually something simple, a sandwich, leftovers, whatever was in the refrigerator, standing at the kitchen counter more often than sitting down because sitting down for a solo lunch at the kitchen table felt too pointed, too much like a declaration of solitude that I wasn't ready to make. I'd watch some television in the early afternoon, which was something I'd never done on a weekday in my adult life, and which carried a low-grade feeling of wrongness that never entirely went away, no matter how many months passed. Not guilt exactly, more like the feeling of wearing the wrong clothes for an occasion, slightly off, slightly uncomfortable, even when nobody was watching. The television was company of a sort. I'm not too proud to admit that. The background noise of it, the voices and the movement, it filled the room in a way that silence didn't, and silence had become something I had a complicated relationship with. I'd always liked quiet. When I was working, I craved it. Sought it out in small pockets of the day, that 15 minutes alone in the car before I went inside at night, the early morning before Carol was up. But there's a difference between chosen quiet and imposed quiet, between the silence you step into deliberately and the silence that's simply there because there's nothing else. My body was talking to me more now, too. That was one of the things nobody warned you about. The way slowing down paradoxically makes you more aware of everything your body is doing. When you're busy, when you're moving through a full day at pace, the minor complaints stay in the background. The stiff knee in the morning, the lower back that takes a while to cooperate, the general sense of machinery that's been running a long time and needs a little more warm-up than it used to. These things existed when I was working, but I didn't have time to pay them much attention. In retirement, I paid them plenty of attention. I'd notice the knee when I came downstairs in the morning. I'd feel the back when I bent down to pick something up. I'd sit down in my chair in the evening and take an inventory, almost unconsciously, a daily audit of what hurt and what was stiff and what seemed different from last week. It's not hypochondria exactly. It's something that happens naturally when your body has more of your attention than it used to. And it creates a particular kind of low-level anxiety that lives somewhere between genuine health concern and the awareness that you are aging. That the process is ongoing and irreversible, and that the man you were at 50 is not entirely the same man standing in the bathroom mirror at 68. I started noticing the faces of older men in public. At the grocery store, at the diner where I'd sometimes go for breakfast on a Friday morning just to be somewhere with other people. Men my age and older, sitting alone mostly, nursing coffee, looking at their phones or out the window or just at nothing in particular. I'd watch them and wonder what their stories were, whether they were lonely or simply comfortable in their solitude, whether they had figured something out that I hadn't, whether they were struggling the same way I was and just hiding it the same way I was. There's a kind of fraternity among older men that doesn't announce itself, that operates through sideways glances and brief nods, through the shared language of people who have lived enough to recognize something of themselves in a stranger's posture. I felt it with those men in the diner. I felt like we were all sitting with the same quiet thing, and none of us had quite found the words for it yet. The evenings were better than the days in some ways. Carol would be home by late afternoon on the days she volunteered, and having her there changed the atmosphere of the house in a way that was immediate and noticeable. Not that we talked constantly. We've been married long enough to be comfortable in the same room without performing for each other. But just her presence, the sound of her in the kitchen, the particular way she'd ask about my day with genuine interest, the shared routine of dinner and the evening news and whatever we were watching together before bed, it gave the day an ending, a shape, something to arrive at. The nights themselves were harder than they used to be. I'd wake up at 2 or 3 in the morning with the kind of alertness that feels completely out of place in the middle of the night, lying there in the dark with my thoughts running and no particular reason to quiet them because tomorrow didn't need me rested for anything specific. I'd lie there and think about all manner of things: money, health, the kids, the grandkids, time, the abstract and enormous fact of time and what I was doing with it or failing to do with it. Carol slept beside me steady and quiet, and I'd listen to her breathing sometimes and feel grateful for it, and feel guilty about the gratitude because it felt like I was grateful just for proof that I wasn't entirely alone in the dark. Some nights I'd get up and go downstairs and sit at the kitchen table in the dark for a while, not turning any lights on, just sitting there with the orange glow of the microwave clock and the occasional sound of a car passing on the street outside. Those were strange hours. Not frightening, not desperate, just very quiet and very honest. The kind of hours when you can't pretend you're fine because there's nobody to pretend for. Just you in the dark, and whatever you actually are when all the daytime distractions fall away. I was a man in his late 60s who had built his life around being useful and was no longer certain he was useful to anything. That's what those dark kitchen hours kept bringing me back to. Not in a self-pitying spiral, not catastrophically, just as a plain impatient truth that I hadn't figured out what to do with yet. There's a particular kind of thinking that comes with the long, unscheduled hours of retirement that I wasn't prepared for, and it's the kind that turns backward. When you're working, your mind is oriented forward almost entirely. The next problem, the next quarter, the next shipment, the next thing that needs doing. Forward is where the work lives, and so forward is where your attention lives, and the past stays mostly in its place. Visited occasionally but not dwelt upon, because dwelling takes time and time is the one thing you're always running short of. In retirement, the past has a way of making itself available in a new and insistent manner. The hours are long and quiet, and the mind, looking for something to do with itself, turns back. It turns back and it looks around and it takes inventory, and not all of what it finds there is comfortable. I don't think of myself as a man with enormous regrets. I want to be clear about that. I made decent choices on the whole, held to my values reasonably well, tried to do right by the people who depended on me. But there's a difference between a life without regrets and a life where you've had the time to look at every corner of it honestly, and the honest looking reveals things that the forward momentum of a busy life was very good at keeping just out of view. The one that comes back most often, the one that settles on me in the quiet of those long afternoons or the dark of the early morning hours, is the kids. Not in some dramatic way, not because I was absent or neglectful in any way that would show up on any reasonable accounting of fatherhood. I was there. I provided. I showed up to the things that were required, and many things that weren't. But there's a category of presence that goes beyond showing up, that has to do with being genuinely, unhurriedly, fully there. And I'm not sure I gave my children enough of that. David was born when I was 31, Michelle 2 years later. Those early years of their lives coincided with the most demanding years of my career. The years when I was building something, proving something, climbing from floor supervisor to regional manager to the position that eventually became my identity. I was home most evenings. I coached David's Little League for 2 seasons when he was 8 and 9, which I'm still genuinely proud of. I was at the school plays and the graduations and the important occasions, but there were years, long stretches of years when I was physically present in the house and mentally somewhere else entirely. When I'd come home with the day still running inside my head and sit at the dinner table and respond to the conversation around me on a kind of autopilot, technically there, but not really there in the way that children need their fathers to be there. I remember a specific evening when David was maybe 11, 12. He'd come home from school wanting to tell me something, some story about something that had happened with his friends, the kind of thing that seems small from the outside, but is the whole world to a kid that age. And I remember sitting on the couch with a file folder in my lap, reviewing something for a meeting the next morning, and giving him the half attention that was all I had available. I remember him trailing off in the middle of whatever he was saying, and I remember saying something like, "That's great, bud. Yeah?" And I remember him going quiet and leaving the room. And I thought about it for maybe 30 seconds, and then went back to the file folder. I think about that moment sometimes in the long afternoons, and I think about how many versions of that moment there probably were that I don't remember specifically, but that existed just the same. The moments when I was half there, the moments when the job got the good version of my attention and the family got what was left. Michelle and I have a warm relationship now. We're close in the way that adult daughters and their fathers can be close. The kind of closeness that developed more fully after she was grown than it ever quite managed to when she was young. But she was a teenager when I was at my busiest, and teenage girls need things from their fathers that I'm not sure I always knew how to give, or had the bandwidth to give even when I knew what was needed. She never said anything about it directly. Michelle isn't the type. But there are things a parent can sense in the careful way an adult child phrases something, or the particular warmth that's present when it's present and slightly withheld when it's not. And I've sensed those things enough times to understand that I left some gaps in her growing up that I wasn't aware of leaving at the time. Carol took up the slack. Carol always took up the slack, which is both something I'm grateful for and something that sits uneasily on me when I examine it honestly. She managed the household and the children and the social calendar and the school communications and the doctor appointments and the emotional weather of the family, all while working part-time for most of those years and being the kind of steady, warm presence in our children's lives that I was intermittently. I thanked her for it sometimes, not nearly enough, and I told myself that my contribution was the financial one, the stability, the foundation that made everything else possible, and that was true. But it was also a convenient way of not looking too hard at what I wasn't contributing. We've talked about this some, Carol and I, in the careful, honest way that long marriages allow for. She's never been accusatory about it. That's not who she is. But she's been honest, and her honesty has helped me be honest with myself. And the picture that emerges from that honesty is of a man who loved his family genuinely and completely, but who expressed that love primarily through provision and protection, through being the one who made sure the bills were paid and the roof was sound and the college funds were growing, and who was less practiced at the softer expressions of love, the ones that require you to put everything else down and just be present with another person without an agenda or a time constraint. I miss things too. Not the big things. I was mostly there for the big things. But the small things, the ordinary Tuesday evening things, the homework help sessions, and the bedtime conversations, and the slow weekend mornings when a family just exists together without purpose or destination. Those were the things the job ate most reliably, and those were the things, I understand now, that accumulate into something much larger than any individual moment. They accumulate into the texture of a childhood, into the felt sense of being known and valued by your father, and I gave my children that texture in patches, rather than in the continuous whole cloth that I wish I had given them. I don't say any of this to punish myself. I've done enough of that in the quiet hours, and it doesn't change anything or help anyone. I say it because it's honest and because the long, unhurried hours of retirement have a way of demanding honesty from you, whether you're ready for it or not. The past doesn't need your schedule to be clear before it arrives. It just arrives, and you either look at it directly or you spend a lot of energy looking away, and looking away is exhausting in its own particular way. What I've tried to do, imperfectly and slowly, is look at it and accept what I see without letting it become the whole story. I was a flawed father and a good one. I was an absent husband in some of the ways that matter and that devoted one in others. I was a man doing the best he knew how, with the tools he had and the understanding he developed up to that point. And that's the most honest thing I can say about it. Somewhere around the 8-month mark of retirement, I made a decision. Not a dramatic one. Not the kind you announce to anyone or write down in a journal. Just a quiet internal shift from waiting for things to feel better to actually trying to make them feel better. I'm not sure exactly what prompted it. Maybe it was the accumulation of those long, empty afternoons finally reaching some kind of tipping point. Maybe it was a conversation I had with Carol one evening where she said, gently but directly in the way she has, that she was a little worried about me, that I seemed like I was just going through the motions, and that she thought I needed to find something that actually engaged me rather than just occupied my time. She was right, and I knew she was right. And having someone say it out loud gave it a kind of permission to be addressed that it hadn't quite had before. So I started trying things. That's the only way I know how to describe it. I started trying things with the genuine intention of finding something that stuck, something that gave the day a reason rather than just a shape. The first thing I tried was volunteering at the local food bank, which a friend from church had been doing for a couple of years and spoke about with real enthusiasm. I went on a Tuesday morning feeling cautiously optimistic, and the work itself was fine, sorting donations, stacking boxes, helping with the distribution line. Physical and simple and genuinely useful in a concrete way that I could see and measure. The people were kind. The other volunteers were a mix. Some retired like me, some younger people doing community service hours, a handful of regulars who'd been coming for years and had the easy familiarity of people who share a purpose. I went back the following Tuesday and the Tuesday after that. It was good. Not transformative, not the thing that suddenly made everything click into place, but genuinely good in a modest and solid way. I kept going and I'm still going now. And while I wouldn't say it filled the hole I was feeling, it gave me something real to point to each week. A place where my presence made a small but actual difference. That mattered. I also tried a woodworking class at the community center, which I'd always thought might suit me. I'd done small projects around the house over the years, built the shelving in the garage, replaced a fence section, basic stuff. And I'd always thought there was something satisfying about working with your hands in a way that produced something tangible. The class was held on Thursday evenings in a workshop space at the community center, taught by a retired shop teacher named Gerald, who knew his craft inside and out and had the patient, unhurried manner of someone who genuinely loved teaching. There were 6 of us in the class, all men, ages ranging from probably 55 to Gerald himself, who was close to 80. We were building small side tables over the course of the 8-week session, and I found that I liked it more than I expected to. Liked the focus it required, the way a piece of wood demanded your full attention in a way that didn't leave room for the circular thinking that plagued my empty afternoons. When I was at that workbench, I was just there, just in that room with the smell of sawdust and the sound of tools and Gerald's voice correcting my technique with good-humored patience. It was one of the first times since retirement that I'd felt genuinely present in a moment without an underlying current of restlessness running beneath it. I finished the table. It wasn't perfect. There were some joints that a real craftsman would have winced at, but it was solid and it was mine, and I put it in the corner of the den and Carol said it looked nice, and I felt something about that small object that was disproportionate to what it actually was. Because it wasn't really about the table. It was about having made something, having taken raw material and produced something from it that hadn't existed before. I hadn't done that in months. The making of things, even small imperfect things, turned out to be something I needed more than I'd known. I signed up for the next session. I tried golf more seriously too, got a few lessons from a pro at the course Phil and I played, worked on my swing with the kind of focused attention I hadn't given it before. Golf was helpful in a specific way. It gave Phil and me a regular reason to be together. And Phil, who had navigated the retirement transition better than I had, was good company, and good for me in ways he probably didn't realize. We play 9 holes on Wednesday mornings when the course was quiet and cheap, and then sit in the clubhouse afterward over coffee and just talk. Not about anything consequential most of the time. Sports, the neighborhood, our kids, whatever it was in the news. Man, talk. The easy, undemanding kind, and I came to value those Wednesday mornings more than almost anything else in my week because they were the closest thing I had to what I'd had at work, the daily company of people I knew well enough to be comfortable with. I looked into some part-time work. I won't pretend I didn't. Not because I needed the money, but because I missed the feeling of being somewhere professionally, of being in an environment that operated with purpose and consequence. I looked at a few consulting possibilities in logistics, my field, where my experience might have had some value to smaller companies. I made a couple of inquiries, had one phone call with a small freight operation that was looking for operational advice on a contract basis. The call went well enough. They were interested. But when it came to actually committing, something stopped me. I'm not entirely sure what it was. Partly the fear, I think, of going back to something and finding that I couldn't perform the way I once had, that the knowledge was still there but the energy wasn't, or that I'd been replaced not just institutionally, but actually that the industry had moved past what I knew in ways I hadn't kept up with. And partly something else, something harder to name, a sense that going back wasn't really the answer, that what I was looking for wasn't the job itself, but what the job had represented, and that no part-time contract arrangement was going to give me that back. So I let that possibility sit, and eventually it faded, and I didn't pursue it further. I started reading more, which was one of the things I promised myself I'd do, and was one of the promises I actually kept. History mostly. Some biography, a few novels that Carol recommended and that I approached skeptically and finished gratefully. Reading turned out to be one of the genuine pleasures of retirement that lived up to what I'd imagined. Not because it filled the hole or replaced what was missing, but because it was something I could sink into fully and come out of feeling like I'd been somewhere, like my mind had traveled even when my body hadn't. There were afternoons where I'd sit in the armchair by the window and read for 2 or 3 hours and feel more like myself than I had all week. Not the self I was at work, not the manager and problem solver and decision maker. A different self, quieter, more interior. A self I was only beginning to get acquainted with after 68 years of not having much time for him. I'm not going to tell you that searching for purpose resolved itself cleanly or quickly, because it didn't. It was more like a slow process of accumulation, adding things one at a time and seeing what actually took root and what fell away, learning through trial and genuine effort what I actually responded to versus what I'd thought I was supposed to respond to. The food bank took root, the woodworking took root, the reading took root, the golf took root, partly for the game itself and mostly for Phil. Other things I tried and let go of without too much attachment. A painting class that confirmed I have no talent or patience for visual art. A local history group that was interesting but populated by people whose company I didn't especially enjoy. A brief and unsuccessful attempt at gardening that Carol found quietly amusing and eventually took over herself with considerably more success. But the trying itself was important. The willingness to feel awkward and uncertain and occasionally ridiculous in pursuit of something real, that turned out to be a muscle I needed to build, and building it, slowly and imperfectly, was one of the more honest things I did in that first year of looking for my footing in this new version of my life. Acceptance didn't arrive the way I thought it would. I think I expected it to come as some kind of resolution, a morning where I woke up and everything felt settled, where the questions that had been circling me for the better part of a year had finally landed somewhere solid and stayed there. That's not how it happened. It happened the way most real changes happen, gradually and without announcement, through the slow accumulation of ordinary days that were each slightly more bearable than the ones before them, until one day I looked back and realized I was standing somewhere different from where I'd started without being able to point to the exact moment I moved. There was an afternoon in the spring of my second-year retirement that I keep coming back to as a marker. Not because anything significant happened, but because of the quality of feeling it had, which was different in a way I noticed at the time. I was sitting on the back deck that I'd finally finished rebuilding, the one I'd started that first summer and completed over the following months in unhurried stretches. And the weather was the kind that only exists in Ohio for about 3 weeks in May. Warm without being hot, dry without being harsh. The kind of afternoon that makes the whole difficult winter feel like it was worth sitting through. I had a glass of iced tea. The yard was green in that particular saturated way of early spring before the summer heat bleaches everything out. Carol was inside. I could hear the faint sound of her on the phone with her sister. The neighborhood was quiet in that familiar weekday way. And instead of that quietness feeling like an indictment of my circumstances the way it had for so many months, it just felt like what it was. Afternoon. Spring. My yard. My deck that I built with my own hands over the better part of a year. I sat there and I didn't feel the pull towards something else. I didn't feel the restlessness that had been my constant companion through those first long months. I just felt present, actually, and fully present, in a way that I recognized as different because of how long its absence had lasted. I'm not saying I had figured everything out. I hadn't. I'm not saying the questions about purpose and identity and usefulness had all been answered. They hadn't. But somewhere in the previous months, through the food bank Tuesdays, and the woodworking and the Wednesday golf with Phil, and the long afternoons with books, and the quiet, honest conversations with Carol, I had begun to construct something. Not a replacement for what I'd had, not a substitute career or a performed version of fulfillment, something more like a self that could exist in retirement without constantly mourning the self that had existed before it. That was the shift. Not finding something that felt as important as work had felt, but slowly releasing the requirement that something feel that way. Work had been the primary organizer of my identity for 37 years. And retirement had asked me to reorganize around something else. And the process of doing that was longer and harder and more disorienting than I had any idea it would be. But it was also, I could see now from the small, quiet distance, genuinely necessary. Because the man I was when I was purely defined by his function and his professional role was a man with a lot of momentum and not much stillness. A man who was excellent at moving through his life but less practiced at simply being in it. Retirement had forced me into stillness, had taken away the momentum and left me with myself, and the first months of that had been genuinely painful in ways I hadn't had language for. But the stillness, once I stopped fighting it, had given me something too. It had given me time with Carol that we hadn't had in decades, the unhurried kind, evenings that didn't have a next-day work pressure hanging over them, mornings where we could just sit with coffee and talk about nothing consequential and feel no urgency to be anywhere else. It had given me the woodworking and the reading and the food bank, small things, but real ones, things that were mine because I'd chosen them freely rather than because they were required. It had given me a different relationship with my own body and its rhythms, a slower and more honest one. And it had given me, perhaps most importantly, a quieter kind of self-knowledge. The kind that only becomes available when you stop moving fast enough to outrun your own reflection. I won't pretend the hard feelings went away entirely because they didn't. There were still mornings where the emptiness had weight. There were still nights where the old questions came back in the dark and I lay there with them until the light changed. There were still moments of sharp and unexpected grief for the version of myself that used to walk through a building and feel the room respond. That grief didn't disappear, but it became something I could hold rather than something that held me. And that difference between being held by a feeling and being able to hold it is the closest thing to acceptance that I've found. I'm not going to stand here and tell you I have it all figured out. That would be dishonest, and you'd hear it in my voice if I tried. But I've been through enough of this now, enough of the disorientation and the quiet grief and the slow rebuilding, that I have some things I wish someone had told me before I walked out of that office for the last time with a sheet cake and a handshake and a head full of expectations that didn't quite match what was waiting for me. Not advice exactly. I don't think of it as advice. More like things I've noticed. Things that turned out to be true in my experience and that might be worth sitting with if you're anywhere near where I was or heading toward it. The first thing is that nobody tells you about the identity part. Everyone talks about retirement in terms of finances and health and travel and hobbies, the practical and the pleasant, and almost nobody talks about the fact that for most men of my generation, and probably for a lot of women too, work wasn't just a job. It was the primary answer to the question of who you are. It was the structure that held your sense of self upright. And when it's gone, that structure goes with it, and you're left needing to build something new from materials you've never worked with before. That's not a small thing. That's actually a very large thing, and it deserves to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as ingratitude or weakness. If you're still working and retirement is somewhere on the horizon, I'd gently suggest starting to think about that question now. Not the financial planning. You've probably got people helping you with that. The identity question. Who are you when you're not your job title? What do you actually care about when you're not caring about what the job requires you to care about? It's worth asking before you need the answer. The second thing is about time. I thought retirement would give me time, and it did, but I wasn't prepared for what an abundance of unstructured time actually feels like from the inside. It doesn't feel like freedom at first. It feels like a room with no furniture. You need to put things in it deliberately, not just activities to fill the hours, but things that actually matter to you. Things that connect you to other people and to a sense of contributing something, however small. The difference between a day that has purpose and a day that's merely occupied is something you feel in your chest, and it's worth being honest with yourself about which kind of day you're actually having. The third thing is about the people. I isolated more than I should have in those first months, partly out of pride, partly because I didn't have the words for what I was experiencing, partly because men of my generation weren't raised to talk about emotional struggle in any direct or comfortable way. And that isolation made everything harder. The Wednesday golf with Phil, the Tuesday mornings at the food bank, the woodworking class, the evenings with Carol where I finally started being honest about what I was going through. Those connections were not peripheral to my recovery from the disorientation of retirement. They were central to it. We are not built for the kind of solitude that retirement can impose if you let it. And reaching toward other people, even when it feels unnecessary or awkward or like something you should be past needing, is not weakness. It's just being human and honest about what humans need. The fourth thing I'd say is about the body. Pay attention to it, but don't let it become your primary occupation. I spent too many months in a low-level negotiation with my aging body, cataloging its complaints and measuring its decline, and it wasn't good for me. The body is going to do what it does. Staying active matters. The doctor is right about that. Keep moving. Keep the machine running as well as you can. But the hyper-awareness that comes when you suddenly have all day to notice every ache and stiffness, that's something to watch for and gently redirect. Your body is not the most interesting thing about you at this stage. Your experience is. Your perspective is. What you've learned over 60 or 70 years of living in the world is genuinely valuable, and turning all that attention inward onto your physical complaints is a way of underusing something worth more. And the last thing, the one that took me the longest to understand and that I'd most want someone to hear, is that the silence is not the enemy. I fought the silence for a long time. I filled it and avoided it and resented it and feared it. But the silence is where you finally meet yourself on honest terms, where the noise of a working life stops covering for you and you have to sit with who you actually are and what you actually feel and what actually matters to you. That's uncomfortable, sometimes genuinely painful. But it's also where the real work of this stage of life happens, the interior work, the looking back and the making peace and the slow discovery that you are more than what you did for a living, that the person underneath the job title has dimensions worth exploring even now, especially now. I'm sitting on the back deck as I finish telling you all of this. It's early morning, the best part of the day now that I've made my peace with mornings, and the light is doing that thing it does in late summer, where it comes in at a low angle and turns everything it touches a particular shade of gold that doesn't exist at any other time of day or any other time of year. My coffee is hot, which it isn't always, and the neighborhood is quiet in the way it's quiet before the world fully wakes up. That particular stillness that belongs to the hour before everything starts. The backyard needs mowing. I'll get to it this afternoon, or maybe tomorrow, and the fact that I can make that choice without consequence is something I finally learned to receive as a gift rather than a reminder of purposelessness. It took a while to get here. It took longer than I expected, and was harder than I was prepared for, and asked more of me than I anticipated when I walked out of that office, with my cardboard box and my sheet cake memories and my head full of plans that turned out to be less complete than I thought. But I'm here, sitting on a deck I built with my own hands over the better part of a year, drinking good coffee in the early morning gold, with Carol still asleep inside, and the day waiting open and unhurried in front of me. And I can say honestly and without performance that I am, in the way that matters most, okay. Not every day is good. I want to be honest about that, because I think the story of retirement that gets told most often skips the hard parts or rushes through them to get to the peaceful resolution, and that version of the story doesn't help anyone who is sitting in the middle of the hard parts wondering why their experience doesn't match the brochure. Some days the emptiness still visits. Some mornings the silence still has weight. Some nights I still lie awake in the dark and feel the absence of what I used to be in the world. Feel it the way you feel a tooth that's been pulled, in the space where something solid used to be. Those days and mornings and nights are real, and I'm not going to pretend otherwise. But they are no longer the whole of it. They are part of a larger life that also contains the food bank on Tuesday mornings, and the woodworking in the garage, and the books in the armchair by the window, and the Wednesday golf with Phil, and the evenings with Carol that have a depth and ease to them now that the working years, with all their pressure and forward momentum, didn't always allow for. I am 69 years old. I have lived enough to know that every stage of life asks something different from you, requires a different kind of courage and a different kind of letting go. This stage asked me to let go of the identity I'd built over 37 years and find out who I was underneath it. That was the hardest thing I've done. Harder than anything the job ever asked of me. But what I found underneath, imperfect and quiet and still learning, turns out to be enough. It turns out to be, on the best mornings, sitting here in this gold light with this hot coffee in this yard that needs mowing. More than enough. If you've stayed with me this long through all of it, the quiet mornings and the long afternoons and the dark hours and the slow finding of footing, then I think maybe some part of this story touched something in you. Maybe you're somewhere near where I was. Maybe you're already through it and recognized yourself in the telling. Maybe you're still working and you felt something in these words that made you think about what's coming and what you want it to look like. Whatever brought you here and kept you here, I'm grateful for your company. There's something I'd like to ask you, and it's simple. If any part of what I shared today felt true to something in your own life, leave a comment below and tell me about it. Not because I need the validation, but because these conversations matter. Because the things we carry quietly for too long get lighter when we finally say them out loud to someone who understands. You might be surprised how many people watching this right now are sitting with something very similar to what you're sitting with, and how much it can mean to know you're not sitting with it alone. And if this story meant something to you, if it gave you even one moment of feeling understood or less alone in whatever you're navigating at this stage of life, I'd be grateful if you'd consider subscribing. There are more stories here, more honest conversations about the things that don't get talked about enough, and I'd be glad to have you along for them. Take care of yourself. Take it one morning at a time. That's all any of us can really do.